Picture a man 40 feet in the air, standing on a 6-inch wooden post, with nothing holding him to it but 2 steel hooks strapped to his shins and a leather belt around his waist. No harness. No net. Below him lies a tangle of wires, some dead, some carrying enough current to stop his heart in an instant, and he often had no way of telling which was which. This wasn't a stunt. This was a job. Millions of men did it, every single day, for over a century. They're the reason a message could cross a continent in seconds instead of weeks, the reason your grandparents' farmhouse lit up for the first time, and the reason the lights come back on after a storm tonight. They're linemen. And for a few decades, theirs was one of the deadliest jobs in America. The job was born with the telegraph, when the U.S. Congress passed the Pacific Telegraph Act in 1860, funding a line to connect the country coast to coast. Somebody had to actually climb the poles and string the wire. There was no manual. No training. No safety gear. The earliest pole climbers simply wrapped one leg around the wood and hauled themselves up, the same way a kid might climb a backyard tree, except this tree was 60 feet tall, swaying in the wind, and surrounded by other men doing the exact same thing on poles down the line. Eventually somebody had a better idea. Strap a sharpened spike to your leg so it bites into the wood with every step. The story goes that the design was borrowed from soldiers who'd climbed trees during the Revolutionary War to scout for the enemy. Whether or not that's exactly true, the tool stuck. Local blacksmiths started forging individual sets of climbers for linemen on request. Each one slightly different, each one entirely improvised. Standardization was decades away. For now, the rule was simple. Get up the pole however you can, fix the wire, and get back down before you fell. Telegraph work was dangerous, but it was electricity that turned line work into something closer to combat. Starting in the 1880s, cities began stringing high-voltage power lines onto the very same poles already carrying telegraph and telephone wires. Nobody had really planned for this. Overhead, a single pole might be wrapped in wires from a dozen different companies. Telegraph, telephone, police, fire, and now arc lighting, with almost no consistent insulation and no agreed-upon safety standard between any of them. The result was a job where one wrong wire, brushed at the wrong moment, could kill instantly. Historians estimate that between the 1890s and the 1930s, roughly 1 in 3 linemen died on the job, the overwhelming majority from electrocution. For context, that's not a workplace with a high accident rate. That's a workplace where simply showing up for your shift for long enough was, statistically, a coin flip you'd eventually lose. Men doing a job that dangerous, for around 15 to 20 cents an hour, eventually did what dangerous, underpaid trades have always done: they organized. In 1891, a group of electrical workers met in St. Louis and formed what would eventually become the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, still one of the largest unions in North America today. The man who pulled it together was a traveling lineman named Henry Miller, a widower in his early 30s with no fixed home, who'd spent years moving from city to city, sleeping in boarding houses, organizing electrical workers wherever the work took him. Miller's union pushed for the basics that didn't exist yet: training standards, safety equipment, and some kind of floor under wages that had been driven down by an industry growing far faster than anyone could regulate it. It worked, eventually. But eventually is the key word, and we'll come back to Henry Miller himself a little later in this video, because his own story doesn't have the ending you'd hope for. Here's something stranger. The most famous lineman in American history isn't real, and he's not even from where you'd think. In 1968, songwriter Jimmy Webb was driving across the Oklahoma Panhandle when he spotted a solitary lineman perched on a telephone pole, working a handset, with telephone poles stretching to the horizon in every direction. Webb later said he mentally put himself up on that pole and imagined the man talking to someone he missed. He wrote the song that afternoon, and then, for reasons even he couldn't fully explain afterward, set it in Wichita, Kansas, a place that had nothing to do with what he'd actually seen. Glenn Campbell recorded it almost immediately, reportedly choking up in the studio because the lyrics made him think of home. Wichita Linemen became a massive hit, was later inducted into both the Grammy Hall of Fame and the Library of Congress's National Recording Registry, and is regularly ranked among the greatest songs ever written. Bob Dylan has called it exactly that. All from a glimpse of an anonymous utility worker out a car window. And the job didn't stay confined to old photographs, either. Since 1984, real linemen have gathered every year for the International Linemen's Rodeo, which started with about a dozen teams and has since grown into a competition with over 1,000 participants. Events include a timed hurt man rescue, where competitors race up a pole to retrieve an injured colleague, and the speed climb, affectionately nicknamed the egg climb, where linemen sprint up and down a 40-foot pole with a raw egg in their mouth, getting penalized if it cracks. It's part skill showcase, part family reunion, and part proof that the trade's old culture of pride and dark humor is alive and well. Now, back to Henry Miller, and to one of the strangest, most public deaths in American electrical history. On October 11, 1889, a Western Union lineman named John Feeks was working on what he believed was a low-voltage telegraph line, high above a busy Manhattan street, at the height of the lunch rush. Unknown to him, a storm the night before had knocked a high-voltage arc-lighting wire into contact with the telegraph lines nearby. When Feeks lost his footing, he grabbed for the nearest wire to steady himself, and was electrocuted in front of a crowd of horrified onlookers, sparks visibly running across his body before he fell. It became one of the defining moments of what newspapers at the time were calling the electric wire panic, a wave of public fear over the chaotic mess of overhead cabling strangling American cities. The outrage was real enough that it pushed New York to start burying its power lines underground, a practice that's now standard in most major cities. Henry Miller, the lineman who founded the very union meant to protect men like Feeks, didn't get a peaceful ending either. On July 10, 1896, just 5 years after he organized that founding convention in St. Louis, Miller suffered an electric shock while working on a pole and fell to his death. The man who'd spent his life fighting for safer conditions for linemen was killed by exactly the hazard he'd organized against, in exactly the way he'd always feared. Today, line work is nowhere near as deadly as it was in Henry Miller's era. Modern insulation, fall arrest gear, and decades of hard-won safety standards have made sure of that. But it's still physical, still done at height, and still often performed in the worst weather imaginable, because that's exactly when the grid needs them most. Every time the power snaps back on after a storm, there's a real chance someone is up a pole in the dark and the rain to make that happen. It's a strange kind of legacy, an entire industry quietly transformed by men whose names mostly went unrecorded, except for one of them, immortalized by accident in a song about a place he never actually worked. If you liked tracing the wire on this one, stick around. There are a lot more forgotten corners of communication history still to dig up here on Signal History.